I want to share with you some thoughts and some cases as well of which address this question really. How can we connect responsible research and innovation with honest regulation in Europe? Reflections on scientific knowledge as political economy. Now, I don't want to be reductionist here and suggest that scientific knowledge is only political economy. We have always to avoid that kind of reductionist character of our own language here. But I want to point to some of the political economic, if you like, framing forces that shape the way that scientific knowledge is shaped, particularly in the domains where it's public. So regulation of innovations, of course, is one of those. But so also is science communication and scientific advice to policy decision makers in the form of scientific knowledge as public authority, as distinct from scientific knowledge as research. I'll launch in, as usual, for me, I've over-prepared. I think we've got an hour and a half, and I could talk for about 2 hours on these slides alone, but I promise you I'm not going to. So I hope there'll be plenty of time for discussion, questions, and elaborations and so on. And I very much want to encourage you to bring your own research, your own specialist knowledge into the exchanges and the conversation. So, where do we start? Regulation, I want to suggest, should be, anyway, a key part of responsible research and innovation as a question mark and as an aim. Not all innovation is produced by research, and not all innovation is technical scientific. It's often social. And in fact, techno-scientific innovation is also social. RRI, I'll abbreviate it from now on, has thus far neglected regulation as if it's somehow irrelevant to innovation and research. But regulation obviously is a gatekeeper for most innovations which relate to public policy, which are governed by public policy. And thanks. And thus far, the scope of regulation, there's a history to this which I'll come back to later, which predates risk assessment. But regulation nowadays is confined pretty much totally to risk assessment. But there are also questions which are often raised in public discourses and conflicts and controversies about questions about benefits, to whom, are they achievable, have they been achieved, have the promises of benefits been fulfilled or not in material reality, and also questions about alternatives, alternative ways of achieving the same kinds of ends and social benefits if they're there. And these questions are also salient and rational, but they're not part of regulation. In fact, they're legally excluded from regulatory processes and risk assessment as its scientific backbone, if you like. And I would say, and many others join me in this, that although it's essential in governance processes, risk assessment is a failed mode of governance. It's inadequate, it doesn't address all the salient questions, it's often biased, it's falsely claimed to be scientific and therefore worthy of scientific authority with no qualification, and it omits key questions. And here I just want to try to give you a bit of a visual representation of one of the dimensions of this. This is meant to be a schematic representation of knowledge and innovation life cycles. So top left, we've got research and development, where promises, hopes, expectations, selective social interests, socio-technical imaginaries, as Sheila Jasanoff and colleagues have called them, are in play. This then leads in various ways to science-led innovation, where very often there's no assessment, or at least no public assessment. Of course, private corporations, whoever might be controlling or paying for the innovation process, and indeed the R&D, have assessed their own commercial interests in these investments and innovations. Benefits are often presumed and purposes are unquestioned. The innovation leads to various uses and benefits of different kinds, and also to risks and impacts of different kinds also. Risk assessment and risk has become pretty much the sole focus of assessment and the sole frame of recognised meaning, so that public responses to new technologies are very often called public perceptions of risk, as if that's the only thing that people are perceiving or responding to. And those issues which arise over those technologies as public issues are often called risk issues or scientific issues. And that framing of what the issue is actually quite often very inflexible and very unresponsive to evidence of public responses based on other than misperceptions of those risks. So I'll be elaborating on this with some examples in a minute, but also just to take this a bit further. There is, of course, a need to improve risk assessments and make it more reflexive and both epistemically and socially more inclusive. By epistemically inclusive, I mean the fairly well recognized point that most regulatory institutional processes are often monodisciplinary, even nowadays, when the problem that the experts confront in providing a risk assessment are typically multidisciplinary and also actually include non-disciplinary knowledges in the form of practical experience-based knowledge too. But there's also a different and less obvious need to open up and address the upstream questions that are currently left to fate. And by upstream, I mean the questions in the top left and middle part of that schematic diagram, which was the previous slide. And when we move our attention upstream in that way, logically we ask extra questions, not just about risk, but also about what is this innovation trying to achieve? What's the social benefit that it's promised to provide? Are those benefits actually achievable? Under what conditions? Are those conditions themselves implementable? And also, what alternative innovation trajectories might there be if the investment were made to them rather than to the one in question? Those are the kinds of questions that anybody who sits on any expert panel, whether for a European body or for a member state body, anyone on such an expert committee will tell you, we can't ask those questions. We're not allowed to ask those questions. The science has already limited by the legal character of the regulatory terms of reference that they have to operate under. And another part of the problem for that compression into the downstream end of the life cycle that I just outlined is the continuing power of the idea that science just reveals what is there in nature. That's all it does. Innocently, it just reveals that. So whatever innovations are being promoted, developed, put up for regulatory approval or whatever, there isn't any alternative. That's just natural. No questions further need to be asked. And that kind of techno-scientific determinism is still alive and well in contemporary society, and it needs to be questioned, and I would suggest also revised. That's not to throw out scientific knowledge at all. In fact, it's actually to say we can and should, and we need richer scientific knowledge than that which is actually possible under that kind of deterministic imaginary. And imaginaries themselves of what future we're trying to build also themselves need to be, first of all, rendered explicit, because they're often tacit, and secondly, questioned and challenged, and perhaps validated, perhaps not, but anyway, questioned in a healthy kind of way. Now, when we come to responsible research and innovation, which has become, as you'll be aware, very much a part of European R&D and innovation processes, with its legal adoption as part of the Horizon 2020 programme, 70 billion euros or thereabouts. I'll just dwell on the existing understanding and state of play a little, and then give some cases which challenge how we're actually understanding the implementation of this and the principles that are involved in it too. So there's a distinction initially between process and outcomes-based approaches to responsible research and innovation. How are we going to judge that? How are we going to describe it and monitor it and implement it? Are we going to do it according to processes which can be deemed responsible, who they include and exclude, what kind of questions are raised, by whom, in what order, and so on. What kinds of evaluative procedures are adopted in order to assess and attempt to improve and develop responsible research and innovation. So, of course, this means meeting certain conditions in practice, whether they're process conditions or maybe outcomes based conditions. In other words, can we define responsible research and innovation by reference to outcomes? And how do we actually understand the relationships between outcomes and intentions in research processes, which at least somewhere in there are supposed to be about unpredictability? Otherwise, what's the point of doing research? If we're never going to be surprised, then research might not have achieved as much as we hoped it would. And after all, it's pretty expensive, as we know. So, in other words, analysts and scholars need to identify for policy not only what these conditions of responsible research and innovation are, but also how, and indeed if, these conditions can be achieved and sustained. And policy attempts now also to define and monitor indicators for RRI. This is just one statement from a Horizon 2020 program document, Engage 2020, about the vision, if you like, that underpins the responsible research and innovation front or program, however we like to describe it. So you can see here recognizable features of previous action programs from the European Commission on Science and Society, or Science in and for Society, to use the proper language, and so on. Wider engagement of research and innovation with European citizens, stakeholders and users is a crucial part of it. And regardless of what role you play in research and innovation, you'll need to consider how societal actors can work with you to address societal challenges. Well, as you know, that's how Horizon 2020 has been defined, but that only raises lots of questions. It doesn't answer them by any means. And the four key principles have been identified by academic colleagues and also by René von Schomburg, who some of you will know in the commission in DG RTD, have identified these 4 principles, defining principles of RRI. That it should be inclusive, it should be anticipatory, it should be reflexive, and it should be responsible. Sorry, responsive. Of course it should be responsible. This is an attempted definition of that. And they then go on to define the importance of citizen and stakeholder engagement in implementing this. And just to underline how far this has already developed and established itself, not only is it actually a legal part of the Horizon 2020 programme, but also policy indicators have been explored, researched, and this report from the expert working group of the Directorate-General for Research and Innovation actually happily had as one of its members our colleague and friend Angela over here, and chaired by Roger Strand, or Roger Strand as he is known, from the University of Bergen, and himself actually an experienced coordinator of several European Union research projects. And this is part of the preamble of Horizon 2020 programme text. Just to, again, it basically repeats and elaborates on the same kind of principles. That there's a reflection of those 4 principles defining responsible research, which actually all contribute to the push for public engagement, and also reflecting the principles already well established in the European Union research and development and science and society action programs of gender equality, of inclusiveness, and those familiar kinds of principles that define ethical reflection and analysis and meeting certain ethical targets. And just by the by, the indicators report, the working group did also emphasize beyond the Commission statements themselves on RRI, that other principles which the EU is already committed to explicitly in its policy programs, for example, sustainability and ethics or justice, social justice, ought also to be part of the aims and objectives of research and innovation programs if we want to call them responsible and therefore presumably worthy of public support and financial support too. So here we see that reflected in von Schomburg's own definition of a few years ago of the process features of responsible research and innovation. Now, as you already know, I've got a long history here. I was writing articles and publishing on technology assessment before risk assessment was even institutionalized. That is quite a while ago, in the 1970s. And in many respects, the technology assessment that was institutionalized pretty well around the world, the US, Japan, the OECD countries anyway, European countries too, particularly maybe the Netherlands and Denmark, but also the European Commission itself with the STOA programme of the Parliament, Science Technology Options Assessment. Interesting, options assessment indicates a rather broader kind of field of view than only technology or later risk assessment. And risk assessment's development in the 1980s, originating largely with the US National Research Council's definition of risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication in 1983, the Red Book as it's called, basically usurped technology assessment and rendered it more precise, but thereby actually narrowed down the questions that might be asked about innovation. And so risk assessment could claim to be precise and therefore more controlled, and therefore it was hoped also more authoritative, because a lot of the impetus behind the institutionalization of risk assessment and scientific advice for policy more generally has been about generating public authority, and has been about generating or maintaining, we'd like to hope, public legitimacy for those institutions involved, including, of course, the European Commission services. Maybe particular, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, DG Sante, or Sanco as it was, Consumer Protection and Security, where many of the risk assessment processes and objects of attention and objects of controversy very often as well are actually the responsibility for informed, properly scientifically informed decision making. So on this kind of historical trajectory, in the 1990s, elaborations of technology assessment attempted to establish themselves alongside risk assessment. So constructive technology assessment was developed and elaborated quite strongly in the Netherlands, and the Dutch government took a strong interest in it and attempted to implement it in different ways, with the insights from STS and inputs from STS scholars in the Netherlands involved. The same with participatory technology assessment, developed both of them during the 1990s, and also risk governance, which I actually have said, and if we can get to that point, maybe if you like to discuss it, risk governance to me is a contradiction in terms. Risks don't exist without technologies or perhaps natural hazards, natural risks, but basically we're not only governing risk. Risk is an abstraction until it hits us in the form of effects, material damages. And so governance of risk has always struck me as being a rather restricted, overly restricted term. And it's been the term which has been adopted by the International, is it Commission? I think it's Commission on Risk Governance, an industry, academic and policy body with a lot of international funding behind it, maybe particularly from the reinsurance industry. So two-way public engagement with science began formally, in a way, around about the turn of century, around about 2000. And we could think of RRI as a novel, more organic form of such regulatory practices and initiatives. But, and this is what I want to come to, there are huge obstacles. And it's, for me anyway, it's actually undermining the principle if we don't take those obstacles seriously as well and pretend, if you like, in effect, that those obstacles aren't there. That's only going to undermine the attempt to achieve what ought to be, anyway, regarded as a worthwhile and important kind of aim. So this is just an elaboration on the point, which I maybe don't need to elaborate on. This is just how limited, for understandable reasons, but how limited risk assessment is as pretty much the only governance tool institutionalized in order to assess innovations for licensing or not, for broader markets and social uses. These are just a variety of ways which I won't dwell on now, it's taking us slightly off the point. about how risk assessment excludes long-term and large-scale and cumulative effects, and often also actually excludes the impacts of combinatorial forces from innovations, or might be chemicals, for example, in the environment. The REACH directive of a decade or so ago now attempted to make some inroads into the problem that risk assessment for chemicals was always based upon the falsehood that any chemical that you're trying to risk assess exists in the environment on its own. That clearly is an unrealistic basis for trying to do science of the risks of chemicals. And REACH did make some inroads into that, but inevitably it was limited, because as soon as you try to actually include in your risk assessment multiple independent factors, they've mainly been independently introduced into the environment, into our food, into our water, into our bodies, then how can we possibly do a risk assessment for them? We can't control for the variables that are in play. And that's always been a dilemma, that there's a trade-off between precision and realism very often. We want precision for good and understandable scientific reasons, but we can't actually have realism when we attempt to control into artificial models or artificial laboratory conditions, the attempt to test for different possible impacts. So these are just some of the points that are introduced here. Now, just coming to agricultural biotechnologies and often GMOs as being the main topic of this, now of course developed into SynBio and a variety of other innovation trajectories from biosciences and engineering as well. This is just a quote, notice the date on this. This was 1998 from an investment banker that I happened to meet at a meeting sometime in the early 2000s. And this was one of the things that he was saying as an investment banker to the investment community about agricultural biotechnologies, or then GMOs, in the US. He was based in California. I think he's still based in California. That these kind of structural characteristics of the industry, or you could say of industries as was, agriculture, seed, development, innovation, marketing and so on, seed provision to farmers, and chemicals in the form of pesticides have combined. And that's led to a hegemonic situation where very few, reducing number actually, very large global corporations actually own and control the vast majority of global seed production. So farmers are left in a situation where they don't have choice anymore over what seeds they can actually sow and grow in their own agricultural conditions. And that kind of hegemonic concentration is developing. Since Shimoda described this, things have developed even further. And that is a major political economic impact of the technology. And that just completely goes beyond and escapes completely any attempt to assess the technology. If we reduce the governance of the technology to risk alone, then we don't any longer see, or we don't even ask the question, who is it that owns and controls the global food chain? And that might be a rather important question when it comes to considering global food security and justice for global citizens in the large, not just for European citizens or even North American citizens, but for global citizens. So, just a further illustration of this point. In 1998, McKinsey, the global consulting firm, produced a Vision 2020 for a combination of Monsanto, the Indian government, and UK's DFID, the Department for International Development, as part of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, in Andhra Pradesh, a major state in India, a major agricultural state. The industrialized agriculture that this vision was promoting, with the support of the Indian government and UK DFID and, of course, Monsanto, basically spent millions of small farmers through the industrialization of agriculture, the modernization, maybe increasing productivity, depending on how it's defined and measured. But millions of small farmers basically ended up forced to migrate into urban shanty towns. And at a meeting in the early 2000s on this, I asked an official from DFID at a meeting in the UK, have you included this question in any kind of assessments or evaluations which you've done of this technological program? And he couldn't even understand my question as to why that should have been included. And this is largely because the dominant model, post-war model, economic model of development, basically says, yes, you know, you increase productivity, you actually free labor. So you free all these small farmers in India to actually become trained in electronics, telephony, whatever, and they can then join the IT industry in India. And so what's your problem? That was the kind of assumption or projection or imaginary on which these kind of commitments was being based. Those nowhere feature in any kind of assessment of these programs, particularly not an inclusive, deliberative one, which might include, you know, relevant knowledge from all kinds of different actors. And yet this vision has been globalized now. In the World Economic Forum's 2012 report, A New Vision for Agriculture. I'm just looking at time, Angela, my chair. Can you give me an idea? I think I should be aiming to wind up in 15, 20 minutes. Yeah. Is that correct? Yeah, okay, good. So you can see here in this quote from the World Economic Forum's report, this is another McKinsey report for the World Economic Forum. And it was funded by most of the big global food, agrochemicals, seed, food retail, global traders, corporate interests. You can see there a summary point about how we want to convert agriculture into an investment opportunity for big corporations to extract more from the agriculture that's there at the moment and globalize it. And the same with the food, and I'll come to that in a second. So this is just the cover heading of the World Economic Forum report. This is a figure which I think is page 7 of that report. But interestingly for me, when I looked at this, I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. And I looked for discussion of it in the text of this new vision for global agriculture, and I couldn't find any discussion of it at all. It was produced without any comment in that report. So if you look at this, I hope you can see that we have basically 2 decades, from 2010, this report was 2012, don't forget, to 2030. So a decade to 2020, a decade on 2030, a division of the total global production of food in terms of billions of megatons of production. That doesn't sound right, but anyway, the units are not important except comparatively. We see here horizontally across the top, in current production, this is cereal, grain, oilseed, and pulse production. So forgetting meat and fruit and so on and so forth. We see division into low-tech smallholder production, high-tech large-scale production, industrialized agriculture, and production from other sources. which is held constant. And what we see from 2010 to 2030 is basically the disappearance of small, low-tech, smallholder production. Now in India, it's estimated that 97% of farmers actually farm on less than 3 hectares. And 60 to 70% of Indian food production is actually produced on those farms. So, I mean, that was true in 2010. The estimates now may have changed, but basically you can see that that is an incredibly big transformation of Indian agriculture. Sorry, this is global, sorry. I'm thinking about the previous Vision 2020 in Andhra Pradesh. So what I just said, Altieri and others have analysed it, that 60 to 7% of global food production is produced by smallholders saving their own seed, exchanging their own seed, and experimentally growing food with their own seed in that way independently. And industrialised agriculture basically means contracts for those farmers with legal backup, which means that the farmer is forbidden to save and use their own seed. They have to buy from the seed provider, Monsanto, Bayer Crop Science, Syngenta, whoever it might be, and they're obliged. That was the controversial case that Percy Schmeisser in Canada went through when he claimed that actually GM seed had been blown onto his agricultural fields, nothing to do with him, and Monsanto claimed that actually he had basically saved and resown his own seed. So the point about this is that there is an assumption or a vision that global agriculture will be industrialized to this extent. And yet there is no attempt to estimate the impacts of this in terms of, for example, how many more urban shantytowns are we going to have. But also, the other question is that even if, as this vision actually articulates it, even if the productivity per hectare of developing country farmland was to actually increase so that yields per hectare were to increase, first of all, in order to do that, you've actually had to input not only costly, but also hydrocarbons costly, inputs of various kinds, fertilizers, pesticides, and so on, and capital and equipment which needs hydrocarbons to use it, and so on and so forth. You've had to actually transform into high input, non-sustainable, water, basically very, very so irrigation dependent agriculture in a way that actually also produces a system whereby even if you improve the productivity per hectare, which is a question, particularly over the medium to long term, this isn't sustainable. The water table in India, for example, is dropping all the time thanks to big irrigation schemes. A lot of it cotton rather than food, but nevertheless, that kind of industrialized agriculture, monocrop agriculture. And this system and this report makes it clear. These are just the stakeholders. The stakeholders. These are the investors in this World Economic Forum report. You can see there all of the familiar names in global chemicals, agrochemicals, seed, but also global trading, commodities trading. So Archer Daniels Midland and Bunge are two of the most important global traders. Funny enough, Cargill isn't listed there, but that's another one of those big global traders. But the point is that, as anthropologist Glenn Stone has actually noted and described it in India, that actually this system is then being, in commodifying that food into global markets and global commodities, these foods which are being produced in this possibly more productive, let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's a more productive agriculture, at least in the short term. Higher input, those inputs have to be accounted for somewhere. But nevertheless, the commodities are actually being held by those traders until they get a good price on usually the Chicago, because that's the big agricultural commodity exchange system, until they get a good price on the global commodity exchange in Chicago. Meanwhile, therefore, you have those cereals being stored in warehouses in India, and a lot of that rotting and being infested with rats and mice and benefiting from those cereals, whilst the farmers themselves in this system are basically short of food. So you've got this kind of paradoxical situation where you've increased productivity, but you're actually generating a global system of exchange and production, which is actually feeding global retailers who are actually feeding rich, already over-rich in our food and nutrition and so on, over-rich markets in the rich world. And this is going to benefit the global capital process because it's extracting more profit from the resources involved. So it's okay. GDP has increased globally, so what's the problem? And nowhere do we see anybody attempting to actually assess this innovation system in terms of its responsibility, question mark. So here I'm just pointing to, and of course the GM issue is described anywhere you care to go and look. The GM issue is described as a scientific issue. So you can argue, and I would argue, all of this has been done ultimately in front of publics or critics or questioners, consumers. It's being done in the name of science. And, you know, we all in different ways operate under that name. And I think it's worth asking the question, you know, is this actually a responsible thing to be doing? So, when it comes to the stakeholders, having just seen the list of investors in this vision that McKinsey's been tasked with producing, we can see that the stakeholders that the new Vision for Global Agriculture report actually identifies are the following ones. Government, food and beverage companies, storage and processing firms, shipping and transport providers, retailers, IT, inputs companies, banks, and donor organizations. Nowhere do the stakeholders include farmers. I think something speaks for itself there. Not even any other multifunctional land users are included in McKinsey's and the World Economic Forum's list of stakeholders that they want to pay attention to and maybe include in their inclusive deliberations over this vision and the innovation that follows from it. That's a bit of a question, I think it's fair to say. And this is a challenge that RRI has to face, along with all of those who'd like it to be in place. So this is just an investment and entrepreneurship pipeline. That's it. And these are the definitions of public sector and private sector responsibilities in this. And you can see the public sector should basically enable or create an enabling environment for market-driven economic growth and investment and present attractive investment options to the private sector and donors in agriculture in whichever country it might be. So we've got some problems about responsible research and innovation when it comes to considering the conditions under which realistically we have to try and implement it, develop it, and institutionalize it. And I've already noted that point. So the other case I wanted to turn to, which is a more European issue, is actually the case of regulation in the EU through the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, which was established, as you probably remember, in the early 2000s after a variety of problems in Europe, particularly Britain, I think it's fair to say, over things like bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, which was a scandalous treatment of science by government. But scientists, I've got to say, were complicit in that misrepresentation of existing understanding of, for example, the possibility that the pathogen involved might jump the species barrier between sheep and cattle and humans. And we're still counting the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the human spongiform encephalopathy problems that have arisen from that. I don't have time to go into EFSA, so let me just try and summarize it, if I may. There's a particular recent case that I've been working on with a colleague in Norway. He's actually an environmental scientist, an ecologist who works with Daphnia magna, the water flea, which is known in ecotoxicology as a kind of model species for examining the harmful effects, toxic effects, etc., of chemicals and other environmental agents. And he's worked for quite a while on Daphnia magna, published a lot of papers now with his group on GMOs and Daphnia magna. And basically, he has found harmful effects on Daphnia magna of what you'd regard as being credible doses of GM, particularly herbicide-tolerant GM, so often, therefore, mixed with glyphosate as the usual kind of the dominant herbicide globally for GM herbicide-tolerant crops. And he has actually been particularly interested in stacked events. In other words, the stacking of different GM events in a given plant in order to actually produce multiple insecticidal properties to different kinds of insect pests, as well as the herbicide tolerance to glyphosate, to actually allow glyphosate a greater market share effectively of the pesticides market for GMOs, because the only herbicide which is going to work for that crop then is glyphosate. So Thomas Bunn, he's called, has been particularly interested in combinatorial effects from multiple cryproteins which are introduced as part of the stacked GM process. Not just one cryprotein, but actually 2, 3, maybe more, depending upon the technology. And it's estimated now that about 50%, even now, and it's increasing in the future, about 50% of all GM crops that are grown in the world now are actually stacked GM crops, multiple GM transgenic insertions into the crop in order to actually multiply the traits that they will actually show in agricultural production. Thomas produced a paper with his group last year, a year ago, in May 2016, on multiple cryoproteins, the toxins which produce these different effects, looking at questions about non-target species. So things like effects on Daphnia magna. Others research on different non-target insects which might be affected, butterflies, moths, etc. But Thomas's work is on Daphnia magna. And the work which he did previously was actually on the insecticidal maize GM crop MON 810. MON for Monsanto, 810 is just their coding, their name for that particular GM event. And this is an insecticidal transgenic insert which will affect the maize corn borer, so the maize root borer. And so it was evaluated by EFSA, I think initially in about 2007, and approved. And then the German government introduced a ban against EFSA's advice to the Commission, and actually, strictly speaking, illegally. And they justified it with reference to some of Burns' earlier work. So when he produced this paper on multiple cryoproteins and stacked events in Daphnia magna a year ago, the Commission, DG Sante, asked EFSA to actually evaluate Burns' paper. And they asked them in particular whether this had any implications for their previous decision to approve MON 810. And I read the original Burn et al. Paper and the EFSA review, which was published in August 2016. And Burn has since produced a response to EFSA. And what was really interesting was to see how EFSA, which claims, and I might be able to find the... this is EFSA's statement of its fundamental values in its Strategy 2020 document, which was published in 2016. You can see I've emphasized there the emphasis which is given on scientific excellence, on openness, transparency, independence, and also cooperation with other scientists, not just in Europe, but elsewhere in the world. And what was interesting about the EFSA response, in light of these kind of expressed values of EFSA, quite laudable aims to pursue, that they basically, first of all, having been given a policy question that wasn't relevant to Burns' paper, but with reference to Burns' paper, they were asked to evaluate Burns' paper by DG Sante. And Thomas's paper was actually about multiple cryoproteins, when MON 810 is not a stacked GM crop. It's a single insecticidal, I think, cryo-1ab protein insert in order to actually, create the trait of resistance to the maize corn borer. So the EFSA's response to the DG Sante question, this is EFSA acting as scientific contractor to the Commission or DG Sante as policy client. DG Sante needs that kind of scientific advice and input. But in the light of these claims to independence, I was struck by the lack of independence. Thinking as a scientist myself, I was struck by the lack of independence with reference to the question. My first response as a scientist would have been to say, Burns' paper isn't actually relevant to MON 810. What Burn is emphasizing is the importance of research on multiple stacked proteins, which will be in many such crops in the future, and there's a lack of research. Now, EFSA themselves had said the same thing. We need more research on stacked multiple protein, multiple cryotoxin events. There isn't enough research on them. They're going to be growing. They're already growing in the global markets and in European markets. We need to know. And we haven't got that research. That's what Byrne was saying effectively. I've found evidence of combinatorial effects, including combination with the glyphosate, not just between the multiple cryoproteins from the stacking, but with the glyphosate as well in herbicide-tolerant crops. And there isn't enough research. The research that Byrne produced on D. magna isn't enough on its own. We need more research to corroborate that, qualify it, maybe refute it, who knows. But the point is that EFSA defined their interest as being only in MON 810. What they then did was to basically look at Byrne's findings and his methods, and instead of actually communicating with Byrne to ask him about various of his laboratory practices, and no scientific paper ever describes the full range and the complexity of laboratory practice. Never. So there are always things that are omitted, even from the best scientific papers. That's just inevitable because that's complexity of lab practice. So rather than just simply email to Byrne and ask him, did you actually buffer your exposure laboratory solutions of the toxins, and when you mixed it with the glyphosate, did you buffer the pH in this way or that way? They hypothesized that Byrne had adopted particular practices which would have generated false positives in his results. And I found this hard to believe when I read the paper. And so I checked with Thomas Byrne himself, and he said, no, nobody ever communicated with me. He didn't even know that EFSA was reviewing his work. And the first thing he heard about it was when EFSA published their review in August of last year. So from May to August, they were reviewing his work, and yet he didn't even know, let alone was he approached by EFSA in this collaborative, cooperative, open and transparent way to actually ask him about his lab methods. If they had done so, he could have reassured them that actually he hadn't used buffering methods that might have produced false positives, because he controlled the pH stable throughout the experiments. So this is where responsible innovation is dependent upon responsible regulation. And, the pursuit of these aims, if they were being thoroughly pursued, then we might think, well, we'd expect that to be honest and independent and rigorous regulatory practice. But EFSA has a singular authority throughout Europe on particularly environmental risks. And it's got legal standing in that respect. So that, for example, in the 2015 directive, the so-called free-for-all for member states to actually decide for themselves about the cultivation of GM crops, member states which decide not to cultivate GM are not allowed to decide against on scientific grounds, because that's EFSA's defined territory. They can only justify it on non-scientific grounds, which is an interesting state of affairs. We can go further on that, and I think there are further questions to be asked about that in relation to the EU and how we avoid fragmentation, which of course is a bigger political issue than only GM crops or responsible research and regulation. But it is a big question there. And there's been a lot of criticism of EFSA for its conflicts of interest, which have been mainly about corporate Europe Observatory in Brussels has done a pretty thorough research job on the corporate interests that are affecting EFSA's independence and undermining its independence from industry. And that's a pretty strong case. Let me just show you the list. And they emphasize so these are conflicts of interest scandals at EFSA, beginning in 2010. This is a list, and you think, well, yeah, okay, a full page, but it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 pages to 2016. No, 17, yeah, this is a more recent one in 2017. And these are pretty big conflicts of interest too. Not all of them, they're not all consistently big ones, but some of them are really serious ones. And the European Parliament has in fact refused to accept, the audit committees refused to accept EFSA's budget basically because of unresolved conflicts of interest. And these continue. So you can see these, and you're very welcome to take the PowerPoint, or maybe ask Angela for the PowerPoint of this if you want to come to it. But the point is that EFSA has basically, in this bone case, I think, been doing what many scientists do, and many STS scholars and historians of science have shown this down the years. It's countless cases which show this, that once scientists are committed, particularly in public, to a particular scientific position, it takes an enormous amount of effort to actually shift them from that position. That's seen to be a matter of loss of credibility. And yet, if science is open and self-correcting, then what's the problem? The theory of science is it's a self-correcting process. It's a self-correcting institution. And here we can just see the kind of dilemmas which a body like EFSA has when it's claiming to be and wanting to be independent scientific as a body in order to generate public trust, and not just public trust in EFSA, but public trust in European institutions more generally. And here am I, with a government that represents me going after a very hard Brexit when I voted against Brexit. But I can see that there are anxieties and concerns about the fragmentation of Europe, which are legitimate concerns. And I would say that science is actually being used, and I don't mean used deliberately, not at all deliberately and conspiratorially, but I think that science has gained sufficient kind of cultural authority that actually we find science being made to play a role here, which is an attempt to kind of naturalize European unity. When, of course, it's a social, cultural, and political phenomenon if we can achieve it. And science is a separate thing. But here I think we can see a confusion, which is deeply, deeply troubling. And how we actually extract ourselves from this, when I think it's been developing, nobody's designed it this way, don't get me wrong, this is just history in the making. And I think we've got a deeply, deeply troubling situation which we need to find our way out of somehow, and start to make some distinctions that, maybe haven't been made for too long. And we've kind of de-skilled ourselves in the process of actually doing that. So if I could just maybe finish. Yeah, this is the last slide, Angela. Yeah. The other ones are there for anybody when they want to, or if they want to, have a look at them and examine what I've said in more detail. As the Strand report on indicators for RRI noted, the terms of RRI are essentially ambiguous and must in any mature policy world be treated as such and in public as such, not in private only, but in public. And ambiguity here does not mean unreal or trivial. On the contrary, as with risk itself, sustainability, or justice even, ambiguous terms often refer to the most important realities. And trying to reduce these issues to science alone is going to be self-defeating. And if we don't, as part of the RRI frameworks development, enlarge innovation regulatory frameworks and agendas to reflect those unaddressed public concerns that risk assessment can't grasp, even the best risk assessment can't grasp, then we're going to fail with this initiative too. So I'm sorry that sounds very negative. I don't feel as hopeless as I might sound. I just want to face with open eyes the kind of challenges that we're confronting here, and just try to, yes, introduce openness, but also introduce more modesty, I think, into what we're trying to do in these domains. So I apologize for going on too long, and thank you for being so patient. And I hope we've got time for some comments, questions, discussion.